organizations in developing policies, strategies, and so forth. The main findings for the beginning would be that basic civil dialogue mechanisms have been developed in most of the countries in the recent decade. But the challenges, of course, remain in their implementation. So mostly what exists is agreements or strategies or structures, but there is greater need for the legal and practical measures to be developed in the region. So an area of special future attention should be on development and implementation of specific requirements for consultations and involvement in policy and decision making by civil society organizations in the region. So first, going to the framework documents, just to see, so you can see the presentation as well. The framework documents that include either bilateral agreements or strategies that strategy documents for cooperation that were adopted by the public authorities actually lay out a clear basis for this relationship, but also facilitates ongoing dialogue, also mutual understanding between civil society organizations and public authorities. Of course, looking at the historical development of these mechanisms, first and most comprehensive and systematic civil dialogue framework in the region was, of course, developed in Croatia, where the institutionalization of this civil society or government cooperation began with the establishment of the Government Office for Cooperation with NGOs back in 1998. And the main success of the Croatian model, which also includes, of course, the Council for Civil Society Development established in 2001, and National Foundation for Civil Society Development, which was established in 2003, is that it was consensual. The system was developed and resulted jointly in jointly owned institutions, actually, which guarantees substantive participation of civil society organization in the policy making. What this model also provides is a clear set of agreed policy instruments and also defines the role of the civil society, but also the government's responsibilities towards civil society. More recently, looking at the development of these framework documents were developments in Macedonia and Montenegro, where the choice was to develop a strategy of the government, so similar as it was done in Croatia. And also in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where actually a bilateral agreement between the Council of Ministers and the civil society sector was developed. And actually it was developed as I will show later on, it was developed mainly by the civil society actors. So it's really important to know what was the role of civil society organizations in developing these instruments and strategies, but also to show what was actually the role of the EU in supporting of development of these instruments. For instance, in Macedonia, it was actually a program supported by the European Commission for the Arts program of technical assistance project that was implemented in 2006 and 2007, which supported actually the development of the strategy for cooperation of the government with the civil society in the year 2007 until 2011. Another important finding is that it was the development of the frameworks, of framework agreements, were largely driven by local civil society initiatives or networks. This was the case in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the Commission to work and succeed together actually developed a set of strategic documents, including the agreement. And also in Montenegro, where the coalition by cooperation towards the goal was also responsible for the strategy in Montenegro. I mean, the development of the strategy in Montenegro. So, to go further to the most current developments in the region is, of course, development in Serbia, where after considerable lobbying efforts on the part of also civil society, the government has just on the 15th of April 2010 adopted a decision on establishing a government office for cooperation with civil society, which will also work on the development of the national strategy for civil society development as well. Looking at the cases in new member states, though, it is evident that in most cases the framework for civil dialogue is less systematically developed. Probably not the best practice to be looked at, where developments were quite slow, or developments happened in the process of accession, but they were then, for instance, the Slovenia agreement was actually developed by the civil society with strong involvement and actually also financial support from the government. But the agreement was then never adopted by the government, although, of course, the government has its own strategy for cooperation with civil society. What are the good practices, but also challenges that were found in relation to these framework documents? Of course, some were already mentioned and some not. For instance, a good practice, of course, is when these strategies are accompanied by action plan for their actual implementation, such as the case in Montenegro, Macedonia, and Croatia. What is also a good practice of development of such strategic documents, of course, is that it was done with significant involvement of local civil society organizations. As already mentioned, the cases in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Montenegro. Then another good practice, of course, is where documents were developed in close cooperation with civil society organization, or were actually co-drafted by civil society organization and government representatives in form of, for instance, working groups, such as was the case in Montenegro, or a special task force that was involved members of the from civil society and the government, such was the case in Albania, for instance. And as it was already mentioned, there was a strong support from the civil society networks or coalitions in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Montenegro for this end. What's also important to note as a good practice is that the process of development of such strategy usually takes time, and it's quite a comprehensive process. And the cases where it was found that this process was both comprehensive and inclusive was where it was supported by donors on